Is this some kind of joke? The voice cut through the crisp morning air, sharp with condescension. Mike Saunders, standing at the edge of the alleyway, eyed the old man in front of him with a sneer. John Anderson didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his posture relaxed as if this was just another day, another street. The world had changed around him, but not for him. He had seen worse, done worse, lived longer than anyone could imagine. The younger man, full of arrogance and bravado, didn't understand that yet. "What are you doing here, Grandpa?" "This is my turf," Mike continued, his words dripping with disdain. The alley was empty, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. It was a typical morning for Mike, and he found nothing unusual about the old man standing still, unbothered. John's face was weathered with age, his eyes a pale blue, unyielding as steel. A lifetime of silence had honed his senses, and now, standing here, he waited. He didn't respond, just looked past Mike, his hands in the pockets of his worn jacket. Mike, growing more irritated by the second, stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "I said, what are you doing here, old man?" He motioned toward the alley, as if the entire place belonged to him. "You deaf or just stupid? Get out before I make you." John's lips parted, but only to speak a single line, one that seemed to hit harder than any insult or threat. "I'm here for you." Mike froze for a second, then laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "Me? You think I'm gonna waste my time with you? I don't even know who you are." He took another step forward, his hand brushing the handle of a knife tucked into his jacket, a move meant to intimidate. But John didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the gesture. Instead, he stood still, the faintest of smirks tugging at the corner of his lips. "Come on, Grandpa, this is just sad. I'm gonna teach you a lesson you'll never forget." John remained motionless as Mike continued to advance, the air thickening with tension. And then, just as Mike was about to take the final step toward him, John shifted his weight slightly, just enough to make a point. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Mike's eyes narrowed, the arrogant smile fading. Something in John's stance, the calm in his eyes, spoke volumes. It was a warning, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't just some old man, some weak target. There was power in his stillness, something that cut through Mike's bravado. The moment stretched, the calm before the storm. Mike paused, his hand still hovering near the knife, his breath coming faster now. The old man had said he was here for him, and Mike didn't know why, but something about that statement struck a chord deep inside. For the first time, doubt crept in. Just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed, and with it, Mike's confidence began to waver. John took one step forward. It wasn't fast, but it was deliberate. The sound of his boots hitting the ground was louder than anything Mike had heard before, echoing in the silence like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Mike took a step back, then another, his hand dropping from the knife as if it had suddenly become too heavy. For a moment, he was paralyzed, not by fear, but by something more profound, respect. In that one step, John had shifted everything. The power balance had tipped. Mike was no longer in control. John's eyes locked with his, and Mike couldn't look away. There was nothing left to say. The silence that followed was thick, palpable. Mike Saunders, once so full of himself, now stood there, a man confronted by something he could never have anticipated, a quiet strength that spoke louder than any threat or taunt could ever hope to. And in that moment, Mike knew that John Anderson was not a man to be underestimated. Mike Saunders stumbled back, his chest tight, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near his waistband. He had been prepared for a confrontation, expecting fear or at least resistance from the old man. What he hadn't expected was this, the quiet strength, the unspoken command that had rippled through the air when John Anderson took that one deliberate step forward. It was like watching a storm approach, calm at first, then suddenly overwhelming. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The arrogance he had carried into this moment was slowly dissolving, replaced by something foreign, doubt. John Anderson, the frail old man, had done nothing but stand still and look at him. And yet, Mike felt as if he were the one who had been exposed, as if his own strength had been questioned. He couldn't figure out why, but a quiet part of him wanted to step back, to retreat from this unexpected force standing before him. His feet shuffled, his confidence slipping through his fingers like sand. Mike's voice faltered, unsure for the first time since this encounter began. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his tone lacking the usual bravado. John's expression remained unchanged, his eyes calm yet piercing, as if he were looking right through Mike, seeing past his threats and his bravado. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet authority that made Mike feel small in comparison. John spoke finally, his voice low but steady. "I'm a man who has nothing to prove to you." Mike didn't respond. The words sank in, hitting him harder than any insult could. He had spent years using his youth and strength to dominate those around him, but here, in front of this old man, none of it seemed to matter. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space where something deep and unspoken was being understood, where Mike began to realize that he had made a grave mistake underestimating John. Slowly, John took another step forward. It was a small motion, but it carried a weight that made Mike freeze. The air felt different now, charged with something that Mike couldn't quite name. It was like the calm before a storm, the heavy silence before something extraordinary was about to happen. Mike swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't want trouble," he finally muttered, his defiance cracking for the first time. John didn't respond with words. He simply took another step. This time, Mike didn't move back. Instead, he stood there, his mind racing as his perception of the situation continued to shift. This wasn't about intimidation. It wasn't about power. It was something far more profound. Mike had seen strength before, but never in this quiet, unassuming form. He looked at John Anderson, truly looked at him, and for the first time, he realized how wrong he had been. John didn't need to shout. He didn't need to raise his fists. The sheer presence of his calm, unwavering strength was enough to make Mike question his own actions. His own perception of power. Mike found himself taking a step back, not because of fear, but out of respect. The moment was shifting, turning. The tables had been flipped without a single punch being thrown, and now Mike Saunders found himself standing in the presence of something far more powerful than anything he had ever known. Mike Saunders stood there, his back now pressed against the cold brick wall of the alley. His mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. The air between him and John Anderson still buzzed with the intensity of the moment. He could feel the weight of the old man's presence pressing down on him, heavier than any threat he'd ever faced before. For the first time, Mike wasn't sure what to do. He had never felt this way, out of control, uncertain. He had been the one in charge before. He had always been the one to call the shots, the one who walked into a room and took what he wanted. But standing here, facing John, that power seemed meaningless. John's eyes never left his, unwavering, calm, like the ocean before a storm. There was no fear, no malice in them, just a quiet authority that spoke louder than any words could. Mike's stomach churned as the realization hit him, he had underestimated this man. He had assumed that because John was old, he was weak, that his age made him powerless. But now, all that arrogance seemed like a distant memory. John wasn't just any old man. He was a man who had seen things, done things, that Mike couldn't even begin to imagine. The silence stretched on, filling the space between them like a thick fog. Mike shifted on his feet, his eyes darting to the ground, unable to meet John's steady gaze. He felt small, insignificant, as if the world had shifted, and he was no longer the center of it. The truth was undeniable now, this wasn't about strength or age. It was about something deeper, something Mike couldn't quite grasp but knew he would never forget. Finally, John spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made Mike's heart race. "You've got a lot to learn, son," he said, his words not harsh, but firm. "Respect isn't something you get by force." Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no response, no defense. The cocky, self-assured Marine he had been moments ago was gone, replaced by a man who stood before someone who had earned the right to be respected, not because of strength, but because of the life he had lived. Mike felt the heat rise in his chest as a strange mix of emotions flooded him: embarrassment, shame, and something else, something he couldn't name. But there was also a flicker of admiration, of awe. John wasn't just an old man, he was a reminder of the kind of strength that wasn't measured by muscles or fists. It was the kind of strength that came from experience, from having lived through battles that no one else could understand. And now, standing in front of him, Mike understood something he never had before. John had a quiet power that was more intimidating than anything Mike had ever faced. Slowly, John took a step back, his posture still relaxed, as if the confrontation had already ended. He didn't need to say anything more. The message had been received. Mike stood there, his breath shallow, his hands at his sides, unsure of what to do next. He didn't know how to fix what had just happened, but he knew one thing: this moment would stay with him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. And that was a lesson he would never forget. Mike Saunders stood motionless, his chest tightening with a mix of confusion and respect. The old man, John Anderson, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't shouted or even made a threat. But somehow, Mike felt smaller than he ever had before. The swagger he had walked into the alley with was long gone, replaced by an unsettling feeling of vulnerability. He had been ready to intimidate, to impose his will, but instead, he found himself standing before a man who didn't need to prove anything. John's calm demeanor, his quiet strength, had disarmed him in a way he hadn't even known was possible. Mike had been around soldiers, had fought with the best of them, but standing here now, he felt out of his depth. There was something about John, something that came from living a life where every day could have been your last. John didn't have to boast about his accomplishments. They were written in the way he carried himself, in the stillness that spoke louder than any words could. Mike shifted uneasily on his feet, unsure of what to say. He wanted to speak, to somehow regain control of the situation, but no words came. He had thought he knew what power was, but in this moment, he realized how little he understood. John's eyes, still steady and unwavering, seemed to look right through him. They weren't challenging or hostile, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that he was being measured, weighed against something far greater than himself. For the first time, he wasn't the one in charge. The realization was almost suffocating. "You think I'm some kind of weakling, don't you?" Mike finally muttered, his voice low. It wasn't a question, more a statement to break the silence. John didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his gaze never leaving Mike. The tension in the air was thick, but still, John remained calm, unruffled. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not about weakness, son. It's about respect. Something you'll understand when you've been around long enough." Mike clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. He had never been the type to back down, to let anyone have the upper hand, but in front of this man, it felt pointless. "I've seen things you couldn't imagine," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince John or himself. "I fought battles, faced down enemies." John's eyes softened for a moment, but his expression remained calm. "I don't doubt it, son. But there's more to strength than what you've seen on the battlefield. It's the quiet moments, the ones that test your soul, that really show what you're made of." Mike swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so many years focusing on the physical, on the fights, the battles, the wins. He had never stopped to think about the moments that shaped a person's character, the ones that didn't come with medals or recognition. "You think you're better than me?" Mike blurted out, trying to regain some semblance of control. John's gaze never wavered. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just know what it's like to earn respect, to live a life where you don't need to prove anything to anyone." The words hung in the air. Between them, powerful in their simplicity. Mike felt a pang in his chest. He had always thought he understood respect, but now, facing John, he realized how little he truly knew. For the first time, Mike began to question the path he had chosen, the way he had lived his life. He had been so focused on being the strongest, the loudest, that he had never stopped to think about the deeper meaning of it all. He looked at John, not with the anger he had felt earlier, but with a new sense of understanding. Mike had come here to assert his dominance, to make the old man cower before him. But in the end, it was John who had won, not through force, but through something far stronger, wisdom, experience, and an unshakable quiet strength. Mike stood there, his heart heavy, as the realization sunk in. He had a long way to go, a lot to learn before he could ever hope to stand in the same light as the man in front of him. But one thing was certain, he would never forget this moment. He would never forget how a single step had changed everything. Mike Saunders stood still, his thoughts swirling in a way that made him feel like a stranger to himself. The usual confidence that had once come so easily was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing uncertainty. He had never felt this way before. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who dictated the terms. But now, facing John Anderson, he felt as if he were at the mercy of something far greater than himself. He had expected to intimidate the old man, to assert his dominance, but instead, he had found himself humbled. The weight of that realization sat heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe. John's calm demeanor hadn't changed. He stood there, steady, unmoving, as if the world itself had slowed down for a moment to allow Mike the time he needed to understand. For a long time, Mike had thought that strength was measured by the ability to overpower others. But now, looking at John, he realized how wrong he had been. Strength wasn't about size or force. It wasn't about intimidation or control. It was something quieter, something that came from within, forged by experience and the willingness to stand firm in the face of life's challenges. Mike took a deep breath, trying to push aside the turmoil inside him. He had been tested in countless ways throughout his life, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him for the quiet power that radiated from the old man standing in front of him. Mike's hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in a strange mix of frustration and respect. He wanted to say something, to somehow make this moment his own, but the words felt foreign, stuck in his throat. John finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "You've got a long road ahead of you, son," he said, his gaze never leaving Mike. "But that's okay. We all do." Mike's heart skipped a beat. The simplicity of the words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a rebuke. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that Mike wasn't alone in his struggle. Everyone had their own battles to fight, their own lessons to learn. But it was how you faced those battles, how you handled those lessons, that determined who you became. Mike nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling in. He had been so focused on what he wanted to prove, on what he thought he deserved, that he had forgotten the most important lesson of all, respect. And now, standing here, he realized that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, something you gave to others as much as you hoped to receive it. Mike's breath steadied, the anger that had simmered beneath the surface for so long finally starting to dissipate. He looked at John, not with the same arrogance he had carried before, but with a newfound sense of humility. "I get it," he said, his voice quieter than before. John didn't say anything in response. Instead, he simply gave Mike a nod, the smallest of gestures, but it carried more weight than any words could. It was as if, in that one moment, everything had come full circle. Mike had come to this alley with the intention of asserting his power, of making the old man bow to him. But in the end, it was John who had shown him the true meaning of strength. It wasn't in the power to dominate others. It was in the ability to remain calm, to stand firm in your beliefs, and to treat others with respect, no matter who they were. Mike stood there for a long time, the silence between them now no longer uncomfortable, but rather peaceful. He had learned something he hadn't expected to learn today. And in that lesson, he found a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. As he turned to walk away, he didn't look back at John, but a part of him knew that the old man's influence would stay with him for a long time. It was a lesson he would carry with him, wherever he went, for the rest of his life. Mike Saunders walked away from the alley, his mind swirling with thoughts he had never considered before. The feeling of powerlessness that had settled in his chest was still there, gnawing at him, but it was different now. It wasn't the same overwhelming feeling of defeat that he had experienced in the past. This time, it felt more like a challenge, a call to change, to evolve into something better. He had come into this encounter thinking he had all the answers, thinking that his strength, his arrogance, would be enough to make the old man bend to his will. But John Anderson had shown him the truth. Strength wasn't just about muscle or loud words. It was about something deeper, something Mike had never bothered to learn until now. As he walked through the quiet streets, he couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. John's calm, unwavering presence had cut through his bravado like a knife through paper. Mike had always prided himself on being in control, but in front of John, he realized that control was an illusion. The real power came from within, from the ability to remain calm, to stay grounded no matter what life threw at you. He thought about the things John had said, how he had spoken not with anger or frustration, but with quiet wisdom, as if he had seen it all before. And maybe he had. Mike thought about the battles he had fought, the wars he had been a part of. He had always believed that those experiences were what made him strong, that the things he had done in the heat of combat were the measure of his worth. But now, he understood that. Those moments, as intense and defining as they had been, didn't define who he was as a person. It was how he handled the quieter moments, the ones where there was no enemy to face, no battle to win, that truly mattered. As Mike turned the corner onto his street, he could feel a shift inside him. He had learned something today, something he couldn't ignore. He wasn't sure how to put it into words yet, but he knew that his encounter with John Anderson had changed him. He had been humbled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't the man he thought he was. He wasn't the one who controlled everything around him. He was just like everyone else, someone who needed to learn, to grow, to earn respect, not demand it. Mike looked up at the sky, the fading light of the afternoon casting long shadows across the street. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he was on the right path. He was ready to stop fighting for dominance and start fighting for something that truly mattered, his own integrity. And in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt at peace with himself. Mike Saunders sat in his car, the engine running but his hands resting on the wheel, motionless. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the still evening air. He hadn't expected the events of the day to weigh so heavily on him, but here he was, parked outside his apartment, lost in thought. The words John Anderson had said to him kept echoing in his mind, louder than anything else. Respect isn't something you get by force. He had heard it, felt it, but had never truly understood it until now. He thought about the countless people he had crossed paths with over the years, people he had dismissed, belittled, or simply ignored. In his mind, he had always been the one who deserved respect, the one who had earned it through his strength and actions. But John had shown him something else, something far more important than just earning respect. It was about earning trust, earning a place where people didn't have to be afraid of you, where you could stand tall not because you intimidated others, but because you had nothing left to prove. Mike's thoughts wandered to his time in the military, the battles, the camaraderie, the moments of triumph. Those memories had shaped who he was, who he had become. He had thought that they were the foundation of his identity, the reasons people respected him. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of his car, he realized that it was the way he treated others that truly mattered. The true strength wasn't in the fights he had won or the enemies he had defeated. It was in the ability to stand tall, not with arrogance, but with humility, knowing that everyone had their own battles to face, their own stories to tell. He glanced out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. It was a familiar sight, but tonight, everything felt different. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that alleyway hours ago. He had learned something that would stay with him, something that would shape the way he moved forward in the world. He had learned that true strength wasn't in physical prowess or dominance. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, in the ability to listen, to understand, and to respect others for who they were. The realization hit him harder than any battle he had ever faced. The truth was simple, yet profound. Respect wasn't given because you demanded it. It was earned, not through intimidation, but through the way you treated others. Mike took a deep breath, the weight of the realization finally settling in. He had a long road ahead, a lot to learn and a lot to change. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he was no longer the same person who had walked into that alley. He had a new purpose now, one that didn't involve proving himself to anyone, but simply being the best version of himself. As he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, he felt a sense of peace, a calmness he hadn't known in years. He wasn't in control of everything around him, but he was in control of who he was. And that was enough. Mike Saunders woke up the next morning to the sound of his alarm clock blaring, an unwanted reminder of the reality outside his quiet thoughts. The weight of everything from yesterday still lingered, though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was no longer the same person. He had always been a man of action, of physical prowess, someone who believed that his reputation, his strength, was enough to get him through the world. But now, standing in front of the mirror, seeing the man he was looking at, he realized how much he had been wrong. The reflection staring back at him seemed different somehow. The shoulders that had once carried the weight of pride now felt lighter, not burdened by the need to prove anything. He had learned something that day, something that was still settling in his mind. His life, his entire identity, had been built on the belief that power was about control. It was about standing tall, overpowering those around him, and never showing weakness. But John Anderson had opened his eyes to the truth. Power wasn't about being the loudest in the room or the strongest at the table. It was about being unshakable in your own truth, about commanding respect not through force, but through authenticity. It wasn't about making others cower, but about earning their trust through consistency, kindness, and understanding. Mike dressed slowly, his thoughts still occupied with the lessons he had learned. He felt a tug in his chest, a realization that things would never be the same. The life he had lived, the choices he had made, had led him to this point, but they didn't have to define who he would become. The past didn't have to dictate the future. And for the first time in a long time, Mike felt a sense of peace about that. He wasn't sure what the next chapter of his life would look like, but he knew one thing for certain: he was done living for the approval of others. He wasn't going to let his past mistakes dictate his worth anymore. As he stepped out of his apartment, the city noise seemed quieter, softer. He didn't feel the need to rush, to prove anything. He took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel out of place in his own skin. He wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't anymore. He was simply Mike Saunders. The man who had learned, who had changed, and who was ready to walk forward with humility, strength, and an open heart. He walked through the busy streets with a different sense of purpose now, no longer distracted by the need to impress or dominate. The world was still the same, but his place in it had shifted. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true strength comes from within. And with that knowledge, he felt ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were quiet, almost uneventful, but for Mike Saunders, they were filled with a sense of calm he had never experienced before. He found himself moving through life with a new kind of awareness, one that he hadn't known he was missing. The weight he had carried for so long, the need to prove himself, had lifted, and in its place was something far more fulfilling: self-acceptance. It wasn't that he had figured everything out. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there was still a long road ahead of him. But every day felt like a step forward, a step toward becoming someone who didn't rely on the approval of others to feel good about himself. It was a strange feeling, but it was a good one. Mike had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to stand tall in the face of adversity. But now, he understood that true resilience wasn't just about standing firm in the storm, it was about learning to navigate the quiet moments too, the moments that didn't come with a battle to fight. He began to see the world differently, not as a series of obstacles to overcome, but as a place to learn and grow. He took time to listen, to understand others, and to offer respect in ways he never had before. He wasn't perfect at it. There were still times when his old habits crept in, when he felt the urge to assert himself, to take control of a situation. But now, when those moments came, he recognized them for what they were and chose a different path. He chose patience. He chose humility. And most importantly, he chose respect. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Mike noticed a group of young men sitting on a bench, laughing and talking loudly. As he passed by, one of them called out to him, asking if he could help with something. Mike stopped and turned to face them. The young man was holding a flat tire, his expression a mixture of frustration and helplessness. In the past, Mike would have brushed them off, too busy with his own life to offer help. But now, without hesitation, he walked over and knelt down beside them. "Let me take a look," he said, his voice steady and calm. As he worked to fix the tire, the young men watched him, their previous laughter fading into silence. When he finished, the young man looked at him with gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks, man. You didn't have to do that." Mike smiled, standing up and brushing his hands off. "It's no problem. Sometimes, all you need is someone to show you the way." As he walked away, Mike felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. The simple act of helping someone, of offering his time and respect, had given him more satisfaction than any victory or conquest ever had. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had already proven it to himself. And that was enough.